I stopped wearing my Apple Watch and my Oura Ring a couple months ago, and once I stopped wearing them, I realized that there's a bigger narrative at play in this breakup with wearable tech that I'm going through. My early thoughts in learning more about this came from being somebody that was very interested and invested in my own personal data. I was constantly looking at the data, I was constantly analyzing and comparing this month versus last month, this year versus last year, all of those kinds of things. And I was recently listening to an episode of the Diabolical podcast called Liv Schmidt and the Sexless Allure of SkinnyTok, where at the end they actually talked about the Oura Ring, and it was after I had already stopped wearing the Oura Ring, and they talked about this removal of a somatic connection to the body. And one of the things they said was, if your goal is optimization, your end outcome is never going to be pleasure. There were a lot of comments that they made throughout this section of the podcast that I found to be very interesting, and that led me to this deep dive because I knew I wanted to talk about it further and I knew I wanted more research. So first I'm going to present some of the research that I did and let you know what we're even going to be talking about in this video. I have 3 articles in front of me, 2 of which I reference heavily. The biggest one is going to be Wearable Tech, Bodies and Gender by Elizabeth Wassinger, and that led me to an article called From Data Fetishism to Quantifying Selves, Self-Tracking Practices and the Other Values of Data by Tamar Sharon and Dorian Zandbergen, which were both very instrumental in the building of this argument that I'm going to present, this video that I'm going to present. And there are a couple things within that that I also referenced that I want to touch on. So one of them is Seeing Ourselves Through Technology, How We Use Selfies, Blogs, and Wearable Devices to See and Shape Ourselves by Jill Walker-Retberg. And then both of these articles reference 2 separate books called The Quantified Self by Deborah Lepton and Self-Tracking, which is the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series by Gina Neff and Dawn Nafis. These all broadly also tie into Foucault's Panopticon and The Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway, which is a feminist text from the 90s that uses the cyborg as a metaphor for blurring lines between human and machine. I actually read this text in college, which is really funny to have it come back around in this passion research that I'm doing. But she talks about the 3 big connections, which she believes to be the boundaries between human and machine, nature and culture, and the physical and non-physical. And in this situation, cyborg is kind of a fictional element, but it's also a part of a sociological approach of cybernetics, which kind of rejects the notion that we're separate from our machinery, which makes more sense as we continue through life and are very addicted to our phones and our watches and all the things we'll get into. The other important thing to know that I learned about through this research is a group called Quantified Self, otherwise known as QS, which is a movement and a community of self-trackers with a shared interest in self-knowledge through numbers. So that is their whole thing. This all starts with the false promise of self-tracking, which I want to start by saying that self-tracking is not inherently bad, and it's also not exclusive to wearable tech. When I talk about self-tracking in this video, I'm talking more specifically about the data side and the wearable tech side of self-tracking. It's also important to note that most of these articles were written in 2017 or before. So very interesting in terms of timeline. I wasn't able to find a whole bunch of current research, but this is just what I'm looking at with this 2025 lens on. One of the things that Jill Walker-Retberg talks about is this line between feminized practices of self-representation versus data-driven practices of self-quantification. An example of self-tracking that isn't necessarily wearable biometric data would be a time-lapse selfie where people take a picture every day and see how their hair changes over the course of the year, how they look differently over the course of time passing. But she argues that this can start as early as the first self-portrait in the 1500s and the contemporary practice of shooting selfies. But the concept here is the shifting of using the machines to see ourselves to now being seen by those same machines. And a lot of the talk of self-tracking comes from the QS community and the QS movement, which the Sharon and Zandbergen article called Data Fetishists. And this article also argues that there are 3 main benefits to self-tracking, which is self-tracking as mindfulness, self-tracking as resistance, and self-tracking as a communicative and narrative practice. So again, it's not inherently bad to be self-tracking, and that is very much what they're saying, but we're talking more about the nefarious aspects of self-tracking with digital wearable tech. Because ultimately there is this utopian vision of human and machine harmony, but the reality is surveillance is a built-in condition of use, which leads to that shift of using machines to see ourselves versus now being seen by the machines. There's a lot to unpack here across the board, so I'm going to be periodically jumping back in with a few more points. In this section of Wassinger's article called Media Studies the Machines Are Watching, she talks about how in an algorithmic culture whose economies are run on self-representations that are analyzed by data brokers, search engines, marketers, and governments, the audience for self-representation is no longer just people, it is machines. Pithily summarizing the issues raised by wearable tech and data gathering in everyday life, she asks, how can we create a balance between using our machines to see ourselves and being forced to be seen by machines? For Pearson, on the other hand, this divide is less distinct. In her analysis, wearables lie between media you carry and media you become. Rather than adhere to communication scholar Mark Ondrovic's formulation of the digital enclosure, in which device proliferation depends on conforming to surveillance as built-in condition of use, Pearson is more interested in what post-humanist and Catherine Hales calls technogenesis, where technologies and humans coexist and co-determine each other. In this case, it's not the machines looking at us as we look back at them. Rather, we exist in and through our machines and need to understand how to look towards the future together with a critical eye that disentangles technology from language that establishes immanence. She says, once again, the techno-utopian promise of wearable technology contrasts with its leanings towards techno-enslavement. This whole thing is insane. Overall, this ties into a larger obsession with optimization, which is what Wissinger calls this neoliberal pressure for an optimized, lean, productive body, and the negotiation trap that QS members find themselves in, which is, which do I trust, the empirical numbers or my body's assessment of how I feel? And navigating those tensions between the body and the numbers. When you wake up in the morning and you feel like shit, but your Oura ring says you got a 93, should you now suddenly feel better? Which should you take at face value? And the problem becomes when the external metrics become more trusted than the internal signals. And also the mental labor involved in resisting prioritizing the numbers over the bodily wisdom. But what I think this also ties into is the overall conversation about disordered relationships to health and how they are much broader than just weight loss, and instead the desire to compulsively check these apps is a built-in feature and not a bug, which leads to the gamification problem, where there's a designed addiction and the algorithmic logics are for data aggregation and not for user well-being. For me personally, I saw this in screen time disguised as wellness. So when I was trying to reduce my screen time, which I still am actively trying to do, I still found myself checking how many steps I had taken that day, seeing if I should go for a walk. Has my workout been hard enough? Have I been working out hard enough over the past month? And the connection to Foucault's Panopticon is basically asking, is all of this self-observation actually making us better, or ultimately just another piece of data for me to scroll through? And Sharon and Zenberg talk about the resistance paradox, which is that where tracking is beneficial, it actually involves literally dismantling the tools that we're using. And I think what's really interesting about this is the outsourcing of bodily wisdom, where there's a somatic disconnection masked as enhancement. So this ties back to those cyborg concerns, which is the feminist worry about engaging the body intimately with informatics. And when we blur those biological and technological boundaries, we lean into this technological desire of simply leaving the body behind altogether. In the data fetishism article, one of the things they talk about is they went to a QS meeting and a shared experience of some of the people were this sixth sense illusion that they claimed because they've tracked their bodies so much, they have a more intuitive sense of what's going on. They can look at a plate of food and determine how many calories are in it without needing to actually count them. But there's a cost to that dependency, which is that your natural signals become untrustworthy without the confirmation from the tech. And then a form of resistance becomes choosing the embodied wisdom over the algorithmic control. So who really benefits from this? If we turn our bodies into biocapital, our personal data then becomes just more units of human value to be sold. They also talk about examples like your insurance company offering you a lower premium if you upload your health tracking data, which users can't really opt out of. Or you can, but it comes at a cost. So in the Wissinger article, she references the Lupton book, where she says, Lupton sees self-tracking as a coerced submission of individuals to a corporate and moral imperative to take control of themselves, thereby doing free labor, uncompensated self-tracking, and interactive work, which generates valuable, lively data that is then scraped from the web and fed through data brokering exchanges to extract as much value as possible for corporate entities. For Lupton, this form of control claims to be something which users opt in, but is a framework from which few, if any, can opt out. This ties into people with chronic illnesses or the elderly who need fall care and heart conditions where the AFib tracking is very beneficial. A lot of examples like that. Along the same lines, Neff and Nafis acknowledge that the promise held out to individuals spurring the urge to what they call conspicuous wellness and to practice healthism may very well be a burden disguised as empowerment. In this scenario, users take on tasks whose goals are not so clear as they may seem, prompting questions. Is the technology you're being asked to use really going to improve your health, or is it shifting the administrative healthcare labor onto you in a form of free labor, much like Lupton describes? And it's also this overarching desire to increase self-value, but ultimately for who? Is it for capitalism? Is it to be perceived as hotter on the internet by your peers? Is it actually for your insurance company and data harvesting as a primary beneficiary, which seems to be the case? The individual empowerment narratives end up masking systemic exploitation. And then there's the element of the data protection myth, which is that there's no actual ownership. Self-trackers have no legal access to their own data, according to this article, and because these are data companies and not medical companies, there's no medical privacy protection like HIPAA in place. There's also a tie-in to what's happening with this data outside of your personal interaction with it. In my TikTok video, I talked a little bit about biodata becoming biocapital, and of course she cites this again as saying that the idea that self-tracking can be fun and socially beneficial gets lost as self-tracking cultures have moved into the commercial, managerial, and government domains. Lupton frames individual inclinations to gather data for self-improvement within a dark picture of coercion and control, where intimate biodigital knowledges have already become forms of biocapital as physical and virtual units of human value to be bought and sold in the digital economy. crazy. And even in the QS community, they hold critical discussions about data problems and data privacy. However, unfortunately, community awareness doesn't change the corporate data extraction model. So this is not to say that your data is immediately being sold off, but it's not inherently private. And while you as an individual might not be at risk, your information at large probably is being shared. You might be a randomized number in the list of overall data from New York or the United States, but you won't be you specifically. And the real revolution happens when the quantified self becomes the quantifying self, and this rat race becomes a never-ending thing. As opposed to an active negotiation of what's going on in this one particular moment, it becomes passive consumption. And the difference between using tools temporarily to enhance your awareness about certain bodily functions versus a permanent dependency on this information and the need to exclusively track your workouts. And, oh, I didn't track it, so it doesn't count. Oh, I went to the gym and I forgot my watch. I may as well just go home. That kind of thing is exactly what I'm most worried about as an individual. The bottom line is your body already knows what it needs, and it's less about know thyself through numbers and more about trust thyself through presence. And again, I want to cite the fact that tracking your information, tracking your data is not a problem. There are many ways to do so privately. Many people have been keeping diaries and logs and food journals for years and years prior to us having all of these things. But I think it's funny for me personally, I was a competitive athlete for 6 years and I never wore a watch. And I stopped competing in 2019. I didn't own any wearable trackers whatsoever. I tracked the hours that I slept by making a note of the time when I went to bed and the time when I woke up. And I wrote down my workouts in a notebook. But there was at no point any interaction of me checking my heart rate or checking any of this information. And while it is seemingly valuable, it might not actually be. At this point in my life, I'm not a competitive athlete. I'm not training for anything in particular. I'm not optimizing myself for any external gain. So why do I need to be tracking these things? I think there is so much nuance here. There is so much to unpack and so much to discuss, but hopefully this just sparks a little bit of conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts if you have any experience in this field. If you've stopped wearing a watch, if you started wearing a watch, I now personally am looking for a fancy watch that I can wear it with a nice outfit and a sport watch that I can wear in the pool, and maybe includes a timer. Ultimately, I'm starting to realize that maybe I don't need a pedometer and I don't need heart rate tracking and I don't need my run tracked down to the mile and I don't need any of those other things. And I'm sort of re-envisioning what my life looks like without all of that tracking attached to me and my name and my data. I hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Sophia Mitropoulos. I usually make videos about art, but lately I've been thinking a lot of thoughts. So this is my second video back after a very long hiatus. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you subscribe and like and stick around for the next one. Bye.